David set his jaw and held out the cash. "Take it and go. My mother's been dead for decades." I didn't reach for the money. I just stood there, trembling, while the laughter of 40 dinner guests still rang off the chandeliers behind the closed door. Brittany at the hostess stand smirked. Kyle jangled his keys. I, Dorothy Hartwell, 88 years old, 5'0", living in a groundskeeper's shed on the south side of town, looked at the son I'd spent a lifetime searching for, and felt my heart crack clean down the middle. My knees had gone soft. The hallway lights buzzed overhead, that sickly fluorescent hum that makes everything look like a hospital corridor, and the filet mignon stink from the kitchen was cloying enough to turn my stomach. David's face, Lord, he had Jack's face, the same hard chin, the same deep-set eyes, was closed off like a boarded window. He held the bills between 2 fingers, the way you'd hold a tissue you've already used. I could hear Brittany whispering something to Kyle, and the wet little laugh that followed. My hands were shaking inside my coat pockets, and the envelope with the photograph pressed against my knuckle like a secret I hadn't earned the right to tell. I wanted to say his name, his real name, the one I gave him in the delivery room at Harlan County General, but my tongue was a dead thing behind my teeth. He turned away from me. The staircase lights caught the silver threads in his beard, and for one gutting second he looked exactly like his father walking toward the river on the last morning I ever saw him. But to understand how I ended up in that hallway, clutching a photograph older than half the people in that dining room, I need to take you back. Way back. About a year and a half before this night, to a park bench in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where a woman I hadn't seen in 30-some years sat down beside me and changed the rest of my life. I'd been sitting on that bench most of the afternoon, the way I did whenever the weather was kind enough to let me. My knees ached less in the open air, and the maintenance shed where I slept, Carl the groundskeeper's little cinderblock kingdom of rakes and leaf blowers, got stuffy by noon, the aluminum roof ticking in the heat like a slow clock. I was reading the community paper, scanning the classifieds out of habit. I used to circle job postings for fun, not because anyone would hire an 87-year-old woman, but because it kept my mind sharp. I'd read the descriptions and estimate what each position actually paid after taxes, then check the next week to see if the listing was still there. If it vanished fast, the wage was fair. If it lingered, the boss was cheap. It was a game I played with myself and I was good at it. Decades of stretching $1 will do that to you. That afternoon, a voice I hadn't heard since the Reagan years called my name. Dot? Dorothy Hartwell? I looked up and there was Ruth and Siler, grayer, heavier, but wearing the same open-mouthed smile she'd had when we packed peaches together at the cannery near Harlan all those summers ago. She sat down without asking, the way Southern women do when they've already decided you need company. And within 15 minutes I'd told her things I hadn't spoken aloud in years. About Jack. About the surgery. About the boy they took from me while I was still counting ceiling tiles in the recovery ward. Ruth didn't gasp or clutch her chest the way people do when they want you to know they feel sorry for you. She just listened, her thumb rubbing the worn strap of her purse, and when I finished she said, "My daughter Ellen works with a family placement foundation in Nashville. She's not supposed to do this sort of thing. But let me talk to her." 5 weeks later, a manila envelope appeared in my mailbox, the P.O. box I kept at the Bowling Green post office, $3.40 a month, my one luxury. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A name. David Hartwell. Owner and operator of a restaurant called Copper and Vine, downtown Franklin, Tennessee. My son. Alive. Successful. 30 miles south of Nashville. I pressed that paper against my chest and sobbed on the post office steps until a mail carrier asked if I needed an ambulance. From that moment, every dollar I touched had a destination. My Social Security check came on the third Wednesday of each month. Not much, barely enough for the shed rent I paid Carl in cash, a few groceries from the discount bin, and the bus pass that got me to the clinic when my heart decided to remind me it had almost quit once before. But I started trimming. I stopped buying the community paper and read it at the library instead. I switched from the store brand peanut butter to plain rice and beans, which was cheaper by 11 cents a serving. I calculated it on the back of a receipt. I let my last pair of decent shoes go unresolved and patched them myself with rubber cement and a strip of old tire Carl left by the dumpster. Months crawled by. I kept the sheet of paper with David's name folded inside my coat pocket, right next to the envelope that held his childhood photograph. A 9-year-old boy squinting into a traveling photographer's camera on a bright Kentucky afternoon, a cowlick in his hair, a gap where his left canine hadn't come in yet. That photo had survived a hospital stay, a condemned house, 3 shelters, and a decade on the street. I guarded it the way other people guard jewelry. By January I had saved enough. I called the restaurant from the payphone outside the Bowling Green bus depot, the last working payphone in the county, I was fairly sure, and a crisp young voice told me a reservation for one at Copper and Vine ran $170 prefix, not including drinks. I almost hung up. That was more than a third of my monthly check. But I gave them my name, spelled it twice, and asked for a Friday evening. The voice confirmed without warmth. I took the Greyhound to Franklin on a Friday in late January. The ride was 4 hours and change, and by the time I stepped off at the station my lower back felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through it. The sleet had started. Not snow, not rain, just that gray Tennessee spit that soaks through everything and chills you from the skin inward. I found the restaurant on foot, following the scrap of paper with the address I'd written in my steadiest hand. Copper and Vine sat on a corner downtown, behind a pair of tall glass doors and a valet stand where a young man in a black vest was parking a Lexus. The building glowed amber from inside, warm and unreachable, like a fireplace in someone else's home. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time. My coat, the one I'd worn for going on 9 years, restitched at the elbows, the buttons replaced twice, was damp from the sleet. My shoes had soaked through on the walk from the station. I caught my reflection in the glass and understood, with a slow sinking feeling, what I looked like. Not what I was. What I looked like. I pulled the door open anyway. The hostess station hit me first. A slab of polished walnut, backlit in pale gold, and behind it a young woman with shining lips and eyelashes so thick they looked architectural. Brittany. She was mid-laugh with a couple in matching camel coats when she saw me, and the laugh died on her face like a match dropped in water. Her upper lip curled, not a lot, just enough. Ma'am, I think you might have the wrong address. Her voice was syrup poured over broken glass. I told her I had a reservation. I gave my name. She looked at me as though I had claimed to be the governor. This is a private dining establishment, she said, louder now, letting the words carry so the couple behind me could hear. This isn't. She couldn't even finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The couple behind me shuffled sideways, giving me a wide berth, and I felt the heat climb from my collarbone to my temples. I asked her to check the book. She wouldn't touch the screen. Instead, she called for Kyle, a thick-necked young man in a clip-on tie who appeared from behind a velvet curtain like a bouncer at a nightclub nobody had invited me to, and told him to handle this. Kyle asked for identification. I unwrapped my Tennessee state ID from the handkerchief I kept it in, slowly because my fingers were numb from the cold, and handed it to him. He read my name, glanced at the screen, and his eyebrows went up. "There's a reservation," he said to Brittany, as if reporting a malfunction. "Paid in full." Brittany's jaw tightened, and something ugly flickered behind her eyes. She leaned toward Kyle and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "Then let her go up. Let Mr. Hartwell deal with it. That ought to be quick." Kyle shrugged and pointed me toward the staircase. A long curving thing with glass railings and recessed lights in every step, the kind of staircase designed to make an entrance. I was not making an entrance. I was hauling myself up one step at a time, gripping the rail, my knees popping like bubble wrap, my wet shoes squeaking against the tile, while somewhere below me Brittany was already on the phone, narrating my ascent to someone with a laugh in her voice. The dining room hit me like a wall of sound and light. 40-some people packed into a space that smelled of seared beef, melted butter, and cologne so heavy it sat on the back of my tongue like a coin. The chandeliers threw shards of light across everything. The white tablecloths, the stemware, the watches on every wrist. I pressed myself into the corner by the door, trying to become part of the wallpaper, trying to just breathe and scan the room for my son's face. I didn't get the chance. A man at the nearest table, broad-shouldered, ruddy, a napkin tucked into his collar like a bib, spotted me within seconds. He set down his fork with a clatter and pointed, his finger thick as a breakfast sausage. "What in the hell is this? This isn't a soup kitchen." His voice carried. It was built to carry. The kind of voice that had never once been ignored in its life. The woman beside him, Tiffany, I'd learn later, though I wished I hadn't, swiveled in her chair, bracelets clanking against each other like cheap wind chimes, and let out a laugh that was more bark than joy. "Oh my lord. Honey, did you wander off from somewhere? Do we need to call someone for you?" She said it to the whole room, not to me. She was performing. And the room rewarded her. Laughter rippled across the tables. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make my skin go cold and my vision narrow to a tunnel. A younger man, tall and loose-limbed, clearly 5 or 6 bourbons deep, pushed back from his chair and swayed toward me. "Hey, Grandma. How about a little dance? Music's good tonight." He clapped his hands, slow and mocking, and a few others joined in, the rhythm ragged and mean. I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my wrists, in the bruised place behind my ribs where my heart had been stitched together decades ago. The room was tilting. The lights were too bright. I thought about the 4-hour bus ride, the months of rice and beans, the photograph in my pocket, and I told my legs to hold. A young waitress, barely out of her teens, dark hair pulled back tight, hands full of dessert plates, stopped dead in the aisle. Her face went white, then red, and I watched her mouth the word no to herself, so quietly I only caught it because I was looking right at her. She set the plates down hard on the nearest table, turned to a cluster of other servers huddled near the kitchen pass, and said, loud enough to cut through the noise, "I'm getting the manager. This is disgusting." One of the older waiters grabbed her sleeve. "Sophie, don't. You've been here 5 days. Henderson tips more in one night than you make in a week. Just let it go." Sophie pulled her arm free. "There are things that cost more than a tip." She disappeared through a service door. Nobody at the tables noticed. They were still watching me, the way people watch something unpleasant on a screen, interested, detached, already composing the story they'd tell their friends later. Henderson, the man with the bib napkin, was loudly suggesting that someone call the county shelter. Tiffany was wiping tears of laughter from her eyes with a cloth napkin that probably cost more than my coat. I couldn't move. My feet had fused to the floor, my knees locked, my hands balled into fists inside my pockets, and the photograph's edge was cutting into my thumb. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell every silk-draped, bourbon-soaked person in that room that I had raised a child alone, survived open-heart surgery with coin-flip odds, buried a man I loved before I was 30, and slept in places that would make their heated-seat luxury cars feel like coffins. But my mouth wouldn't open. My jaw was clenched so tight I could hear my own teeth grinding. Then the door at the far end of the room swung open, and there he was. David. Tall, trimmed beard, dark blazer, moving through the tables the way a captain moves through a ship, nodding here, touching a shoulder there. He didn't look at me first. He looked at his guests, reading the temperature. Henderson jabbed his finger in my direction. "Hartwell, you've got a situation." David's eyes finally landed on me, and I felt something rupture in my chest. Not pain exactly, but a pressure releasing, a dam giving way. He had Jack's nose. Jack's jaw. The same slight downturn at the corners of the mouth that made him look serious even when he wasn't. I wanted to say his name. I wanted to cross the room and put my hand on his cheek the way I had when he was small enough to carry. But David looked through me the way you look through a smudge on a window. He turned to the room, smiled, promised free dessert for the inconvenience, and then walked toward me with the polite, efficient stride of a man about to take out the trash. "Ma'am, come with me, please." He held the door open. I followed him down the stairs on legs that had stopped belonging to me. And that is how I ended up standing in that hallway, under those buzzing lights, while my own son held out a fan of bills and told me his mother was dead. I didn't take the money. I couldn't. My hand found the envelope instead, and I pulled out the photograph, yellowed, soft at the edges, the emulsion cracked where it had been folded once by accident in a shelter years ago, and held it up between us. A 9-year-old boy in a too-big flannel shirt, squinting against the sun in front of a clapboard house, a cowlick in his hair, a gap in his grin. David went still. Not calm still. Frozen still. The kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks or bends. "Where did you get that?" he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice had dropped half an octave and his hand, the one holding the cash, drifted down to his side. I told him about the traveling photographer who came through Harlan County one October, how I'd paid $5 for 2 prints, $5 I didn't have, and how I'd kept this one against my chest through every hospital night, every shelter cot, every frozen sidewalk in every town that didn't want me. I told him about the bad heart, the surgery, the weeks in recovery while the state moved faster than I could. I told him I came back for him and he was already gone, and that the file was sealed, and that I screamed at every office in the county until they threatened to call the police. I told him about Ruth and on the park bench, about Ellen at the foundation, about the manila envelope and the single sheet of paper with his name. I told him I saved for months from a social security check that wouldn't cover a single appetizer in his restaurant. And I told him I didn't come for money. I came because I wanted to see his face one more time before my heart, the one they cut open and wired back together all those years ago, finally decided to stop. David stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he put the money back in his wallet slowly, like a man who's just realized the currency is wrong. He didn't embrace me that night. He didn't call me anything. He just said, "I need to verify this." And his voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a man who had built an entire life on the premise that his mother was dead and wasn't ready to let that foundation crack. He asked me where I was staying. I hesitated too long apparently because something shifted in his face. "Where are you staying?" he asked again, softer. I told him I'd catch the last bus back to Bowling Green. He looked at my coat, at my shoes, at the way I was gripping the back of the bench to keep upright, and for the first time all evening he really saw me. Not a disruption. Not a liability. Person. He had his driver take me to a motel off the highway, clean, warm, a bed with actual sheets, and told the front desk to put 4 nights on his card. I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers, still in my coat, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ice machine rumble through the wall. What I didn't know then, what David told me weeks later, was what he did next. He drove home, opened the closet in his study, and pulled out a battered photo album his adoptive parents had given him when he aged out of the house. Inside, pressed between pages of school portraits and Little League snapshots, was the second print. The same boy, the same flannel shirt, the same clapboard house. And on the back, in handwriting he didn't recognize until that moment, 4 words in faded ballpoint. "My sweet little David." He sat on the floor of his study until 3 in the morning. Then he called Ellen at the foundation and asked her to run the records. What came back confirmed everything. But David didn't stop there. And this is the part I'm proudest of, even though it wasn't my doing. He pulled the restaurant's security footage from that Friday night. Every angle. The hostess stand, where Brittany refused to check the reservation. The dining room, where Henderson pointed and Tiffany howled and a drunk man tried to make me dance. He burned the footage onto a drive and sat down with his attorney. Within the month, Brittany was terminated, not for rudeness, but for falsifying guest check records, something the footage review uncovered when David audited her station as a consequence of that night. Kyle was reassigned to a warehouse property David owned across town. Henderson and Tiffany received hand-delivered letters on copper and vine letterhead informing them that their memberships were revoked, permanently, and that their behavior had been documented and preserved. David read me the letter before he sent it. One line stayed with me. "This establishment was built on hospitality, and you have demonstrated that you do not understand the word." He didn't shout it from a rooftop. He didn't make a scene. He simply, quietly, surgically removed every person who had tried to remove me. 5 days after that Friday night, there was a knock on the door of Carl's maintenance shed. I opened it, and David was standing there in the January cold, breath fogging, holding a keyring with a single brass key. "I have a cottage," he said, "on the back of my property. It's small. 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a porch with a swing. Nobody's lived in it for a couple of years, so it needs airing out. But it's yours if you want it." I took the key. It was warm from his hand. He drove me to his house that afternoon and walked me through the front door, where his wife, Claire, was setting an extra place at the dining room table, and 3 children, my grandchildren 9, 6, and 4, looked up from a jigsaw puzzle on the living room floor and stared at me with Jack's eyes. David put his hand on my shoulder. "This is your grandmother," he said. "Her name is Dot." I didn't cry. I was done crying. I just sat down at that table, in that warm kitchen that smelled like roast chicken and fresh bread, and I ate a meal with my family for the first time in over 50 years. The cottage has a porch swing, like he said. On clear evenings, I sit out there with a cup of coffee and listen to the frogs in the creek behind the property, and sometimes David walks over after closing the restaurant and sits beside me, And we don't say much because we're still learning each other's silences. But he's here. And I'm here. And the heart they told me would quit, the one they cracked open and stitched together with wire and faith in a county hospital when my boy was barely old enough for school, that stubborn, scarred, unreasonable heart is still beating. It held on long enough. It held on for this. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope it touched something in you the way it touched me in the telling. If you enjoyed it, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. And if you've ever lived through something like this, a long separation, a moment of recognition, a door that finally opened after years of knocking, I'd love to hear about it. Share your experience in the comments. Your stories matter just as much as this one.